Absolutely. Moses was seen as this military leader who defeated the Ethiopians, or one that defeated other Nubian tribes, or a magush, an alchemist, or and it has echoes in the Bible. You know how Moses was an alchemist, and was able to do all these to make nature do what he wanted. But also that Moses was the teacher of Orpheus, because he was.
I've been all over that verse because I want people to look, guys. These Alexandrians, these Jews in Alexandria, they're calling themselves Orphics. Basically,
That's
they're
right.
saying
Yeah.
Musaeus, this guy from Athens, is the same as Moses, and there's all. So tell us about that, and then let's get back to the Persians.
Yeah, I mean that's just typical kind of popular etymology. In Greek, Moseus sounds like it's the muse, the muses, and so you hear that, and you're like, yeah, that's the teacher of Orpheus. He was also seen, as I said, as a magush, as an alchemist, as someone who can bend the rules of nature according to his will. And so that also shows that the story of Moses and who that was not decided even in the third century BCE. Okay, there was no canonical version. What's interesting in these versions of Moses is that they are not polemic. They're not even debating other versions. They're not trying to show how their version is correct and like the biblical version is wrong. They're simply ignorant. They don't know of the biblical version.
Right. That's another important thing. Is like this Moses is completely different than we think of today.
That's right. Well, it's not. That's what's interesting is it's not completely different. The Bible shows, I think, took all of these images of Moses that were already current in the region, in Ptolemaic, in the Ptolemaic regions, and is the Bible is polemic with those versions. So it takes elements. We do see elements, for example, of Moses doing supernatural things, parting the seas, all of the and tossing the rods, and they become oak. So we do see elements that were popular in the Greek culture being adopted by the biblical authors, but we don't see the other way around. The earlier sources are not arguing; they are simply unfamiliar with the biblical sources.
They present him as sort of like a superhero magus character who's
Correct. Yeah.
doing a bunch of magic, and he's kind of a hero type, typical of Hellenistic
Absolutely. Yeah.
hero character. And it's okay, that is fascinating. You got this Musaeus character in Athens, and then there's Moses down in Alexandria, and they're sort of trying to figure out if it's the same person or not. Orpheus also, and in the James Charlesworth Pseudepigrapha, there's a whole chapter on Orphica text, that are these Jewish Orphica texts. And look at what Orpheus is. He's a psalmist. He's playing music on a harp, and it's theological music. He's called theologian. That's where that word comes from. The first time people ever use the word theologian is for Orpheus, and some of his texts are referred to as apocalypses, revelations. So a lot of the same technical terminology we're seeing for Judeo-Christianity, we're seeing in these Orphics in Alexandria.
Yeah, absolutely. What's interesting is also even in the second century, the Exagogue of Ezekiel. If I'm assuming you're familiar with that. That's a play, a Greek play that was written in Alexandria, probably performed in Alexandria, where a Jewish author that is completely Hellenized. I mean, he writes perfect.
Tragedian, if I'm not mistaken,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. He's Ezekiel the tragedian, and even his version of Moses in the second century, so relatively late second century BCE, is not exactly the biblical version. It's also kind of a mishmash. He is familiar now with the biblical version, and he is dealing with it, or at least the version that is very close to what we know from the Bible. But even in the second century in Alexandria, second century BCE, that's the story of Moses was still not completely canonized. Was not completely did not reach the form that we are familiar today.
You ready for this? This is a question, and your answer might shock some people with this. Who is the first person that we can say with a name not just always mentioned in some biblical text, but that we can put a name and a date on. Who's the first person to mention Moses?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell because we do have some sources that seem to mention Moses, but they are quoted in much later sources. And that we need a huge grain of salt for that. I mean, we do have Hecateus of Abdera, yeah, Hecateus of Abdera, but only quoted in much later Christian sources that are trying to make a point and are polemical.
Oh, so you're saying that's the one they're citing?
That's right.
Because we lost the Hecateus of Abdera.
Correct. Yeah, we lost the original. So they're citing him. Now, in many cases, the citations are fine, but we need to take each case independently and evaluate how likely it is to be accurate. In many cases, I have my doubts, but let's be very open here and say, you know what, let's even accept that we're talking about Hecateus of Dera, late 4th century. So what's that?
Like 320 BC, something like that.
Right. So even then, if that is the first time a Moses is mentioned, that's very late.
Why is Amazon paying me $63,000 a month? Well, I didn't make this kind of money selling yoga mats and toasters.